All right, before you read this opening chapter, I want to give you guys a little bit of a roadmap of what you want to be looking for. And I've tried to argue for a long time that any discipline, whatever it is, whether it be law or medicine or math or biology or religion or theology, is just as hard as learning the language. And so what you really need to be aware of in this opening chapter is the nomenclature, is making sure that you can identify and understand these terms. And I think that she does a fairly good job of defining them. I'm going to do a quick video here. I'll record a longer video kind of talking in a little bit more depth about these terms. But this is some of the stuff you need to look for in the opening chapter. Please, first, be sure that you are aware of the learning objectives. That what I want you guys to be able to do in this chapter is to explain the difference between spirituality and religion, identify the three perspectives used to explain why religion exists in the first place, and to differentiate between the different types of religion, monotheistic, polytheistic, or non-theistic practices. And this is going to be really important to understand the significance of ritual, symbols, and then myth. If you remember, I've already talked a little bit about Alistair McIntyre and how he argues that the foundation of a tradition is its narrative, is these foundational myths that are profoundly true for the people who tell them. And those myths, these narratives, shape our rituals, shape our practices. And so be sure that you really understand what she's talking about there. To contrast, to use her terms here, the absolutists with the liberal interpretations of religious traditions. I'm going to talk about that in a little bit more detail here in a few minutes. I'm a little uncomfortable with some of these terms, and I'll try to tell you why here in a few minutes. So then next, to discuss the major positions that have emerged in the dialogue between science and religion in the 19th century. Now this is very much an American issue. A lot of other countries don't have the same kind of political and religious baggage that we do in the States. So describe how women are challenging the patriarchal nature of many institutionalized religions, and then to identify the factors that contribute to a negative aspect of organized religion. So those are some of the main things we're trying to do. Please be aware of how hard it is to define the word religion. So a lot of scholars, what they do is they go back to the Latin religio is a term that really means to tie again or to connect, to reconnect. And so religion at its core is about connecting perhaps humanity with God, perhaps connecting humanity with other humans who believe similarly, connecting humanity with other humans who are asking the same questions. So I feel like I am very much connected as somebody who identifies as a Christian with my friends who are Muslim, because they and I are asking the exact same questions. What does it mean to be human? Who is God? What is the right way to live? How do I live into who God created me to be? So on and so forth. So religion at its core is about connecting, to tie again, to connect again. And spirituality is this inner, more personal dimension of religion. You'll often hear people talk about, say this phrase, well, I'm spiritual, but I'm not religious. My aunt says that quite often. And what she's essentially saying is that she has these inner practices, these inner beliefs that are not, that might be informed by larger religions, by larger institutions, but are not dependent upon those larger institutions. And to this point, that it's hard to really define religions, as McIntyre argues, that a tradition is historically extended, it's socially embodied, and it's an argument. In other words, religions are processes. They develop over time. They are not fixed. So please be careful that whenever we say, well, Christians believe this, or Jews believe this, or Muslims believe this, is similar to somebody saying regarding Christianity, well, the Bible says this. Well, the Bible is very, very, very diverse. There are, in some Bibles, 66 books, and in some Catholic and Episcopal and other Bibles, there are more books than that 66. And it's really just inaccurate to say that the Bible says one thing. The Bible in and itself is very diverse, written over about 11 or 1200 years by 40 different authors in multiple different perspectives. And so it is maybe more accurate to say, well, the Gospel of Mark says this, or Jesus in Luke chapter 4 says this. Similarly, scholars have really divided the Quran into two different parts, kind of the earlier writings of the Quran than the later writings of the Quran, and they are different, and they have different themes and different modalities. And so we have to understand kind of the temptation that we have to really define these terms in like very simplistic ways, but they are super complex. So in the chapter, I want you to pay attention to these three perspectives as to why religion exists in the first place. One, this materialistic perspective. Second, the functionalist perspective. And then third, the faith or the belief perspective. And I think that all of these are interesting in their own right, and they all probably have some sort of validity to them. Just a term that you might want to be familiar with. Ultimate reality is more of a philosophical term that a lot of philosophers and a lot of scholars use to define God. God in itself is a theological, philosophical term. So whenever you see these terms like ultimate reality, especially if she capitalizes them, that is a way of talking about the divine reality, something that exists apart from what you and I know as our real physical existence. So be sure you understand these three perspectives: the materialistic, the functionalist, and then the faith or the belief perspective. And then spend the last half of the chapter just really paying attention to nomenclature, to defining and understanding these terms. One I think that you guys might find interesting is that whenever scholars talk about the sacred, the sacred realm, where God is, or where the gods are, or even sacred spaces. So on campus, we would define the chapel as a sacred space. That whenever people are talking about non-sacred spaces, places that are not a mosque or a temple or a shrine or a cathedral or a church, that we normally call those profane. And it doesn't have to carry kind of the negative connotation that you would think of when you think of the word profanity, because whenever we're dealing with the sacred, the opposite of that is just the profane, is just kind of the world as it is. Now, don't misunderstand that, please, to think that Jews, Christians, Muslims, Hindus, Buddhists, atheists, so on and so forth, believe that the world is not worth caring for. She addresses that later on. So whenever we talk about the difference between the sacred and profane, please be sure you understand that. Again, pay attention, please, to the language, the definitions of these terms: theistic, monotheistic, polytheistic, non-theistic, so on and so forth. And a couple here on this page. The incarnation. Incarnation is a term that we talk about God taking human form. You see this in Christianity. You see this in other traditions as well. And so be sure that you understand what scholars mean when they talk about incarnation. And you're going to have, she uses this term exclusivist or a universalist claim. There are some people, of course, that think that their religion is the one and only true religion. And then there are other people who argue that all religions are valid in their own right. And so be sure you understand those terms. Again, some of you are probably more familiar with atheism, agnosticism, and then humanism. Here, take some time whenever she's talking about the importance of ritual symbols and the myth. Myth, please understand that our culture kind of screws this one up just a little bit. We think that a myth is something that is not true. We say, oh, it's just a myth. Well, in the scholarly realm, in the academic realm, we understand myths are profoundly true. They just may not be factual. And so if you were to do like a Wikipedia search of creation myths, you will find dozens and dozens and dozens, if not hundreds, of creation stories. Now, academics would call these myths. They are not factual. Nobody was around when the creation of the world happened. The Jewish tradition, and of course adopted by Christianity, they have two, maybe even three creation myths in those early texts. And so are they to be read literally? Well, probably not. And we'll talk about this later on in class 2, but myths are profoundly true for the people who tell them, because they articulate this wider definition of truth, this way of understanding the world, so on and so forth. And so please take some time to understand that. Here, I want to take just a second and really get you thinking a little bit beyond some terms, particularly these two, fundamentalist and then liberal, or even conservative and liberal. I'm not a huge fan of these two terms, especially because of the political baggage that they carry. that when somebody thinks of the word liberal, they might think of that in a positive way or in a negative way, or they might think of fundamentalist or conservative in a positive light or in a negative light. And in our country in particular, a lot of people link conservative religion to conservative politics, and then liberal religious convictions to liberal politics. Now, while that might be valid on some level, I really want to caution you to clumping liberal, as in a perspective regarding religion, to a political party. Okay, that's going to be tough for some of you guys, but I really want to challenge you to try to separate these terms. We in America, we line up our issues. We line them up on one side, and we kind of have these building blocks that, like liberal over here, or over here, and then like conservative or over here. And we line up like a political issue with like a religious issue, so on and so forth. And I'm trying to separate those. So I understand that the reason to use these terms, but she is using them in the more academic sense and not in the political sense. So again, take time to understand the terms of how different scholars study religion, exegesis. I've written tons of exegesis papers having critical examination of religious texts. Every religious text that we know of has been redacted in some form or fashion. And so be sure that you're understanding this. Again, whenever you get to the relationship between science and religion, this is very much an American thing. Although she does look kind of at the history of the development of this, be sure that you understand that that this is kind of something that is unique to our culture. The other cultures are far more okay with listening to science and also practicing their religion. I know at first the Catholic Church was a bit hostile to intellectual and scholarly debates and theories about science. And yet now the Catholic Church employs some of the best Big Bang cosmologists, some of the best theoretical physicists, some of the best biological evolution scientists. And I know at one time the Catholic Church was really against the influx of science. And now, of course, it has really embraced science. And then finally, I want to look here just briefly. Be sure you understand the role of women in religion. I think that she does a good job of this. I will talk about this a little bit more in class. One example that I wish that she would have touched on is the rights to vote that women possess. So correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I think that women received the right to vote in like the early 1920s, like 1920 or 1923, somewhere right in there. And that's in America. Well, women were given the right to vote in the Quran, in Islam, in the late 7th century, the early 8th century. Now, I know you might be thinking, well, Saudi Arabia just now is allowing women to drive. Okay, we're going to talk about that when we get to a study of Islam. But I think that she does make a really interesting point that here in the United States, more women than men are pursuing active ministry through Christian graduate education. So when I was at SMU doing my master's, I do think that her analysis and her data was actually correct, that there were more women in those classes pursuing active ministry than there were men. So what are some of the factors that contribute to the negative aspects of organized religion? Pay attention to this. Be sure that you understand her arguments, and I think you'll be set up for a very thorough and a way to really understand the depth of this chapter.